any means necessary doing Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And my friends, it is Friday, which means we're having another edition of our weekly segment, the Redspin Report, where we discuss sports, politics, and struggle with Nate Wallace, co-host of the Redspin Sports podcast. Nate, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Sean, how's it going? Glad to be back.
It's going well. It's going well. And, I wanted to start today, Nate, by talking about the European Super League. And this is some soccer news. This was an effort that looks like it was being put together perhaps by some wealthy interest that has seemingly come crashing down. And so I was hoping you could sort of help us understand, number one, just what was the European Super League supposed to be, what happened there, and what do you think the implications are in terms of the politics of that sport? And I have to say, soccer, in terms of how it plays out internationally, a deeply political thing. And, they don't shy away from the politics of it, talking about the fans. But just sort of if you could help us understand what was happening there.
Sure. Well, I mean, basically what it was is a break-off of 12 teams. So if you think of like maybe if it would be like similar to having the 12 most profitable NFL teams break away to form their own Super League, where they were going to be able to guarantee TV, whoever the TV people that had the TV contracts, whether it be NBC, ABC, CBS, whatever here in the States, Fox. Same thing in Europe. They have the contract with Rupert Murdoch and Sky News, his media company there in the UK, and they would be able to then guarantee having games on at a that are more appealing. Basically, they would have games on that would be the big marquee matchups, and then the TV networks would be able to then get bigger ratings, and as a result, they would also be paying more to the Super League there. So as a result, like that, that's sort of the setup there. That's the deal. So that was what people were upset about. That's what people were really up in arms about. And really, that's what you see a pushback with. And the thing is that it's like, of course, you have politicians now trying to spin it to say that like, oh, it was like, we pushed back. Boris Johnson even trying to claim credit for this. But really, it was the pushback from working class fans in the streets in Manchester, in Leeds, in Liverpool that made it untenable. Outside the stadiums, just pushing and pushing. You have to realize, too, they were trying to appeal more to an American market, which would have made it impossible. They've already made it where fans this past year, of course, with the pandemic, haven't been able to go. Then you start making it a more TV-centric schedule that's more geared towards international fans. The games wouldn't be during the days, and they wouldn't be in the daytime anymore, even early evening. And then you combine that with the fact that these people, people can say sports, it's an imagined community, but for so many of those folks, it's like that is a site of social engagement. It's a site of social cohesion and coming together for working class people. And it's also, the game has its very working class roots. And they see it as like a sort of effort by international elites led by, the Fenway Group, the owner, John Henry of the Boston Red Sox, who actually has, LeBron as a minority owner. But much smaller percentage than anything Henry has. I think he's around like maybe 2 or 3% ownership in the Liverpool club. But that's sort of the basis there. But I think it's really a testament, like we talk about so much, to what people power in the streets does and how much fear that strikes in the ruling class. And the last thing I'll say is that one difference between U.S. sport and European sport, in the case of like U.S. American football, we'll use as an example and juxtapose it with European football or soccer, as we call it here in the States, is that it's sort of an irony of like capitalism too, because in some ways the U.S. on a very micro level within sport has a much more like kind of like socialist like revenue sharing model in terms of like at least in football, there's a hard salary cap. You could be a terrible team year after year, and you're not going to be kicked out of the NFL. Part of the deal in European football was that no team has just like guaranteed spots in these Champions Leagues, like the UEFA League, the ones where basically the number of points they earn throughout a season, they aggregate all that, and those are the teams that earn their way in. This was an attempt to basically cut that off, to break off the ability of teams to upset the big dogs, to like come in and to have that sort of feeling that anybody can, achieve in any given year, anything can happen. And it really speaks to the monopolization of sport. And that's sort of a tendency within capitalism. So those are all forces that are working, that were part of this, and then part of the massive pushback that happened in the streets, especially in the UK, we saw.
Yeah, Nate, and this really was kind of an interesting exposition of like class politics in sports, I think, because, as much as I don't know about soccer or, football as it is formally called, or the real football, American football is not. It's based on rugby, if anything else. But I mean, the fact that there is, already before this happened, there has already been apparently such animosity toward what soccer fans in England call the Big Six, the Arsenal League, the Chelsea League, Liverpool, Manchester City, Manchester United, and Tottenham Hotspur. Now, as much as I don't know about soccer, I actually am familiar with those teams. They were a part of the Super League, but there was always kind of animosity toward them because of their existing relationship with big money. These clubs are owned by billion-dollar European or other oligarchs already. So there was already like this simmering tension between, the working class, pub going football fans who, were just enjoying the games, and it was a very big part of their lives, and the owners of these leagues who were literally just rolling in money and using this as a way to make even more money, completely, ignoring their working class roots and the people who support them.
No, absolutely. And if I could just quote from, I think, a really good article that was written in Marxist.com and the website for the UK, says Britain fans backlash knocks back Super League. And it talks about like just kind of what you're speaking to, Jacquie. It's like in reality, the interests of the broadcasting multinationals have been hand in glove with football's establishment for decades. I mean, soccer they have been pushing for more live games, more viewer attractive fixtures at times that are suitable for them, of course, not the fans that actually want to go and support these teams and enjoy the social aspect of, engaging and like really as a site of coming together, especially in a time of such loneliness in the world. We've learned so much about mental health despair. And it goes on to say, this is, after all, how professional sport operates in the United States. Games are streamed live at all manners of times and places. And a franchise system is maintained, which operates as a closed shop, involving teams that are better described as brands. Ironically, the main attraction of European football to the capitalists is that unlike U.S. baseball, basketball, etc., it is not controlled by a dominant federation that regulates spending, wages, transfers, and so on. The rich clubs in English football's Premier League, for example, are pretty much free to undermine competition through monstrous overspending. TV money has therefore become central. And in turn, the big media companies, as I alluded to, Murdoch, Sky, are demanding a great deal in return for their cash handout. So that's sort of what the deal is there. And it is sort of interesting because we always typically there's like these narratives amongst liberals you hear that, oh, Europe's so much more progressive or Canada's so much more progressive than the U.S. And of course, the U.S. is not progressive, but it certainly does not mean that just because the U.S. is not progressive, that these other countries somehow are by just, by virtue of not being the U.S. So I think that's interesting in the closed shop nature of, what you have. I mean, basically what goes on and how that's very different than like think of the National Football League here in the States, where you have the worst team drafting first every single year that had the worst record the year before. You have a salary cap. You don't have like the NFL able to just go and pluck guys out of high school or a year of college and offer them whatever they want. And that's where you have the big disparities. And that sort of led to the conditions where the break-off league was sort of a thing. And I'm not convinced that this really dead. I just think they didn't really have a plan and a strategy in place and didn't anticipate this kind of pushback they got. They're definitely going to try to recalibrate in some form or fashion. And we'll just have to see what that leads to, because I think the kind of pushback we're seeing in the streets can also be mobilized against and also is representative of larger frustration and anger towards austerity and towards like things like the European, all sorts of issues such as Brexit, European Union's terrible vaccination plans, just like I mentioned, austerity, And I think they're connected. They're very much connected, actually. And so we'll have to stay tuned and see how this continues to play out.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the National Football League, Nate, and that's actually where I wanted to go next because, of course, the NFL draft took place this week. And what I wanted to touch on is what some people are perceiving as the undue or disproportionate influence of Patrick Mahomes in this whole process. I mean, there was even a piece in The Guardian that called the draft, quote, further proof of the Mahomesification of football. And I was hoping you could sort of help contextualize this. Patrick Mahomes, obviously a popular player there in the league, and I don't know if you think it's true that he exercised some kind of influence here, but I mean, if so, why do you think that is? And just sort of help us understand what's happening here in the context of the politics of the draft itself.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure specifically as it relates to Mahomes and like his and the influence, like people are talking, he's specifically exerting. I can say that he signed the largest contract ever in the history of the NFL. You're talking over a 10-year period, like just north of $500 million. He has an ownership stake now in the Kansas City Royals, the Major League Baseball team, just right next door to where the Kansas City Chiefs play. He was the 10th overall pick in the 2017 draft. Sliding behind a lot of people being picked, and has been just a phenom on the field. One thing the NFL has, ironically, especially with its ultra-reactionary owners, that we're literally a who's who, and it's something that with Redspin Sports we've been going through and breaking down who each of these 32 owners are, what their interests are, what their relationship to the ruling classes in this country. And but within that, they have a club, essentially. They look at the 32 clubs as kind of a it's just funny. It's like within capitalism at that level of like the ruling class, once you've reached that club, they really don't have a problem with like socialism amongst themselves on that level, that we're all super wealthy. We all have insane influence. We want to have revenue sharing. We want to have some kind of parity because they're looking at the overall like well-being of the league. And they're looking to, for them, it's about maximizing revenue. So you don't have the New York Giants, for instance, or the Dallas Cowboys able to spend any more money than the Jacksonville Jaguars spend, or the Green Bay Packers, for that matter, to the smallest market clubs. And that's just a huge contrast to what you see over in European football, where they just go out and buy players from anywhere in the world. And especially with the global game of football, not American football, like being something where, people literally play all over the globe. It's just such the level of exploitation is insane, because you have people just fighting, scratching, clawing from the global south, from all sorts of countries oppressed by imperialism. And really with American football, it's pretty much just North America. But what you had at the draft last night, I mean, you do have it's an exercise in parity. It's like, that when you have to be 3 years removed from high school in order to enter the draft. So you can enter after your third year of college. Then you have every year the team that had the worst record picks first, and the team that wins the Super Bowl picks last. Therefore, to try to, which makes it, not a surprise that in the NFL you often see teams go from being really bad to really good, and also really good to be really bad. It's not uncommon at all. But one thing that really struck me was just like, again, the NFL and how they're trying to, like, in this era, post George Floyd era, post Breonna Taylor era, post pandemic uprisings last summer, really trying to rebrand themselves, like after all the what they would deem the unpleasantness of the Kaepernick situation, right, as being like the woke FL now. And like all this talk about Goodell even mentioning empowering indigenous communities and talking about health disparities last night, talking about bringing people up of nonprofits to announce certain picks in certain communities that are, taking on food insecurity, and like using all these buzzwords, that are really important issues, but that, like, hey, do you not realize the very people that are invested in your game, your corporate sponsors, the very ownership, like of your league? I mean, Johnson & Johnson, Woody Johnson, the New York Jets, for instance. I mean, if you just go down the list, they're invested in a system that is predicated on ensuring things like Medicare for all do not ever come to fruition. Their profits, their wealth, their power is based on that. So therefore, just what a joke it is, and an insult, really, to think that like there's any sort of genuine care about like these issues other than what they can do in terms of optics, right, and branding. And we saw that with the Dallas Cowboys last night. They bring out a woman, and I don't mean to like belittle her at all. I mean, but she's they announced that she is a traumatized, it's like a Iraq war veteran, who is now a licensed social worker in the Dallas area, to announce the pick, who's really excited as a Cowboys fan. She announced Micah Parsons, linebacker from Penn State, but they say that she has dealt with anxiety and depression and is now a licensed social worker but she, we thank you so much for your service, essentially, fighting for our freedom, right? Of course, like no context at all for what that means. And like, where does that anxiety and depression come from? And who are the people that are dead in Iraq as a result of, U.S. action there? And that anxiety and depression is probably a direct byproduct of. It's just astounding to me that no more people don't actually bring this up.
Yeah, Nate. I mean, and the fact that so much seems, I don't know, I hate to use the word rigged, but it just seems to me that there isn't anything fair involved in the NFL draft. And you just, kind of confirmed my suspicions. And last night, I think, was really interesting because a few firsts happened that sort of, I don't know if it means anything that this was the first time in league history that, the opening 7 picks of the draft went to, a one side. 12 of the first 15 picks went to the offensive side. I mean, am I off the mark by thinking that there's a lot of stuff going on in the background between the league owners and the coaches that really pretty much predetermines who goes where, and that all of this, public excitement over the draft is really just for us to think that it's this is a fair system that's unbiased, and that there are no no mechanics going on in the background?
Well, I mean, I will say this. I think it is it's not fair for certain. And all the things that we just alluded to in regards to, the way they exploit patriotism, use jingoism to get people excited, talk about health disparities and all these different things. They're certainly not genuine. I do think competition wise, the people that are running the football, departments and whatnot, I think they really are trying to build the best rosters because they don't want to lose their jobs. I mean, there are different interests. I'm not saying that owners don't get involved at times, in meddle, especially if they want a certain player, they will dictate that. But there's a lot of variety in terms of the league. There's certain owners that are much more hands off, others that are more hands on. But yeah, I mean, there's not some wholesome sort of operation by any means. I think that last thing I'll say is just Kwity Paye, who was a defensive end from the University of Michigan, drafted by the Indianapolis Colts last night, 21st overall. They really were pushing the whole narrative about how inspirational it was for his family overcoming the Liberian Civil War and Kwity being raised in a refugee camp in Guinea, and then having to just fight his way and scratch his way to the top of getting to the U.S. and then ultimately now being drafted. And what a triumphant tale that is for Kwity Paye to make the league. And I'm just thinking, what another example of kind of highlighting an individual case of wow, it's a happy moment, but then trying to look at these terrible things, totally devoid of a geopolitical analysis, the Liberian Civil War, being a refugee camp in Guinea, and turn it into some sort of inspirational tale. That's the stuff that I really have a problem with.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is kind of gross, honestly. I mean, and we know this is a tendency of capitalist culture to uplift successful individuals while sort of leaving out the systemic root of a lot of this. I mean, just the incredible suffering that U.S. imperialism has caused in so much of the world, and then to uphold people who are victims of that as exemplars is just, I mean, like I say, it's just gross on a number of levels and just part and parcel of this broader issue. Well, we thank you so much, as always, Nate, for joining us today. We're going to leave it there. We'll move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C., but we will be back. So please stay with us.